Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace be with you and upon you. May His merciful love and blessings be showered upon you. Bismillah, alladhi la ilaha siwah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. In our previous encounter, as we delved in this wonderful and profound topic of freedom and happiness of the righteous, we spoke about the meaning of freedom and happiness and how they related to the nature of self or heart that we are inside. That happiness is relative as we ourselves are inside. That the self can be of many states, a state in which it is cattle-like, a state in which it is predatory-like, a state in which it is even devil-like, and a state in which, luckily, it is angel-like. Predatory-like or cattle-like or devil-like or angel-like signifies that what we are inside, what moves us inside, what motivates us inside, what we seek to acquire, what fulfills us inside is either cattle-like, predatory-like, devil-like, or angel-like. And so our happiness will be in its reality, not its external and shallow appearance, would be one like that of a cattle or a predator or a devil or an angel. And as we spoke about the happiness at the materialistic level, which is more characteristic of the three lower states of the self, namely the cattle-like, the predator-like, and the devil-like, that seeking such happiness is seeking it through the resources of this world, materialistic resources of this world. And that we argued, and I think it should be commonsensical, that since the human resources, nay, the earthly resources are limited and therefore depletable, all of us seeking a sort of materialistic happiness will lead to the necessary following conclusion that we will not and never have enough to satisfy us since the resources are limited and depletable. What does that mean? That means we will have to compete for those resources. And when I say resources, I do not mean only at the level of the grand concept of resources such as those resources that have to do with the billions and billions of dollars, etc. No, I speak even at the very common everyday level that you and I go through. We'll have then to compete for those resources. And competition, in that sense, with those states of self that we are, will lead to animosity, will lead to dissension, will lead to division, will lead to hate, will lead to a state of no salam, no peace. We will be forced into a state that I think by now most of you know, if not all of you, a state of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest is not a compassionate ideology, is not a compassionate interpretation of reality, is not even, in my view, a real conception of the real world. That will lead us, when we pursue that happiness, and most of us without even recognizing that, without even acknowledging that, to live a life of, as I said, a life of survival of the fittest, and therefore a life of conflict with one another and lack of peace. And unfortunately, hyenas are also happy, predators are happy in their way. Shall we be as happy as predators? The devil is, quote-unquote, happy in his own way as long as he sows seeds of animosity amongst human beings, as long as he still find in himself that characteristic of arrogance and that characteristic of dominion and that characteristic of ridiculing those that are not like him. Devil ridiculed Adam because Adam was made of clay, of dust, and he was made of fire, of flame. Now, the pursuit of happiness, which is not this type, which is angelic, is due to a self, to a nafs, that is not greedy, that is not animal-like, that is not predator-like, that is not devil-like. A person who does not seek to satisfy at all costs his or her internal desires, his or her shahwa, his or her hawa, his or her inclinations, whether they be philosophical, ideological, that will lead to certain tangible desires. No, a person who, on the contrary, fights against such desires, in opposite to the first one who indulged his or her shahwa and hawa. He indulged his or her base self and wanted to attain a freedom of a self and a happiness of a self, of course, by indulging the inclinations of the self and the desires of the self. Whereas the second type of person, the person who seeks a nobler freedom, a nobler happiness, a happiness of the heart connecting with the divine, the way he or she does that is by checking and controlling and not indulging the desires of the self and the inner inclinations of the self. There is a huge difference, indeed, between the two individuals. The second person, because he or she takes it as a principle upon which he or she acts to control his or her desires and his or her inclinations. His or her life is not oriented towards fulfilling what I or what he or she has in his or herself of drives that are internal no matter what. He or she controls those, does not. You know what this will lead to? Obviously, it will not lead to a state of fierce competition. It will not lead to a state of aggression and animosity, but it will lead to a state of ithar, to a state of altruism. Person would, on the contrary, prefer to see others benefiting of those resources as well as he or she does. And sometimes even he would give them preference over himself or herself on account of trying to liberate his or her heart from the strangulating grip of his or her lower self, his or her nafs. And that cannot be attained by indulging the nafs. Altruism, ithar, certainly will lead to such a person to be in adl and in ihsan, to be in justice and in magnanimity. Guess what? Justice and magnanimity, adl and ihsan, are the pedestals for peace. Whereas fulfilling our personal inclinations and indulging them, and I repeat, indulging our personal inclinations always and constantly, even if it were about eating and drinking and sleeping and copulating and playing, as long as we always indulge those uncontrollably, not moderately, not in a way sanctioned by the divine beauty and the divine wisdom, then the result of that is when we indulge ourselves into that which is excessive, into that which is materialistic, the result of that is we will lose that altruistic attitude and we will not be just, we will not be magnanimous. But if we don't, our relationship with the world, with the creation, will be one of affinity, one of symbiotic relationships, one of definitely justice, and most importantly, magnanimity, which contains in it the concept of merciful love, loving mercy, and compassion. And those elements are necessary, as I believe you all would agree, for peace. Peace inside of me and peace outside of me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran tells us about happiness. قُلْ بِفَضْلِ اللَّهِ وَبِرَحْمَتِهِ فَبِذَلِكَ فَلْيَفْرَحُوا هُوَ خَيْرٌ مِمَّا يَجْمَعُونَ. Say, that is, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, say to the world, say to them, it should be on account of the grace of Allah, grace of God, and His merciful love and His rahmah, that you should be happy and happy with. That is indeed better than what they all collect and gather. In other words, subhanallah, to be aware of His grace upon us, to live in His grace, to live in His bounty, to live in His merciful love, to be representative ourselves of His divine merciful love, to be like that inside of us, that should lead us to happiness. That is the happiness we ought to pursue. Not a happiness, my dear fellow brothers and sisters in Islam and in humanity, not a happiness that is cattle-like, not a happiness that is predatory, not a happiness that is devil-like, a happiness that is angel-like. Indeed, it is better than all those efforts and all together the treasures of the physical realm of the world. Let us at this moment take a brief break, and we shall resume shortly after. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace be with you and upon you. May His merciful love and His blessings shower you. After the short recess, we return again in our journey through the beautiful concepts of freedom and happiness of the righteous. We were talking about that beautiful concept of freedom and happiness in Allah, in God. The concept of freedom from the self, not of the self. Freedom of the heart from the self. And by Allah, any human being, any muwahid, any Muslim, any believer who has tasted even for few moments a joy in his or her heart with Allah, he or she will seek that for the rest of his life if it is ever lost, and would give up anything in the world to attain that. That's why one of those who tasted divine happiness inside of his heart had said in this beautiful way, ما الذي فقد من وجدك وماذا وجد من فقدك. ما الذي وجد من فقدك وماذا فقد من وجدك. Oh God, oh Allah, what has he found, the one who loses you? And what has he lost? The one who finds you. Allahu Akbar. What has he found? The one who loses you. All the world, all expressions and conceptions of freedom and happiness without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inside of our hearts is neither happiness nor freedom. It's misery and slavery. My dear sisters and brothers, there is a beautiful concept in Islam related to this, which is called al-unsu billah. Al-unsu billah, uns in God, in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, would perhaps translate as that state inside of us of comfort, of intimacy with God, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A state in which inside of us we're feeling so satisfied, so peaceful, so secure, but at the same time, a feeling internally of nearness and of intimacy with God without any spatial insinuation, without any anthropomorphic type of insinuation. That uns, my God, when it is instilled in the heart, when one is in that state, if one has, again, experienced that even for a short moment of time, it will be the pursuit of his or her lifetime thereafter, to regain even 3 seconds of that. Now, this uns in the Quranic Arabic language, we find very interesting and very beautiful because it is related to al-insan. Al-insan in the Arabic language is a word for the human being. Now, al-insan and al-uns, in other words, it indicates etymologically that the word insan for human being in the Arabic language and the Quranic language has a root in al-uns. And al-uns, as I explained a moment ago, that intimate nearness, peace inside of our hearts with the divine. Note, this is in a subtle, beautiful way telling us that I am not an insan, really, if I do not have uns inside of me with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, I am not a real human being if I do not have that intimacy inside of me, loving, caring sense of nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to God. I lost my insaniya, my humanity, my humanness, if I have lost that uns. And those of us who seek a freedom and happiness, a freedom of self and a happiness of self, away from the freedom of the heart from the self and a freedom of the heart in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I feel, not only I know, that those of us like that truly have not realized their humanity yet. What a beautiful concept it is. The concept of Tawheed, which is the cornerstone of Islam. The concept of the active affirmation of the oneness of Allah, of the oneness of God inside of us and in our lives. Tawheed is itself a word, an active word in the Arabic language, which implies that I actively strive to instill and keep and have only the divine, may he be exalted, inside of my heart. That the presence of any other attachments inside of my heart for other than the divine will deprive me from the freedom that I have, will deprive me from the happiness that I seek, that I'm created to seek. Tawheed is truly the greatest expression of freedom, to be a abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Tawheed. The word abd is often translated as servant or slave, but I think the meaning of that word, the essence of that word, is not slavery in the way we understand it. Ubudiyya is freedom. Tawheed in ubudiyya is freedom inside of us from anything and everything except the divine. When we are in Tawheed, we are free because inside of us, the fullness of our heart is with God. And when God is in our hearts, then everything else is subsumed. After all, when you compare anything, no matter how large, to infinity, it is equal to 0. Any number divided by infinity is equal to 0. Tawheed inside of our hearts, when it is there, the presence of Allah is in our hearts, then it subsumes everything else. We are free. And shirk, in opposite to that, to associate partners with God, meaning inside of my heart, I have so many other attachments. That means my heart inside of me is scattered in so many directions. It sees so many things at the same time. And that is recipe for restlessness, for ambiguity, for anxiety, for depression, for misery, for lack of happiness. Most of us do not connect sometimes the presence of anxieties and depressions in our lives to the absence of that tawheed inside of our hearts. That means we do not link it to the presence of other created things in our hearts. And the more we have inside of our hearts, the more worries we have, the less happy we are, and certainly the less peaceful we are, and therefore the less peace we shall give. Also, the commission of dhunub, the commission of sins, are ways by which we enslave ourselves, we don't free ourselves. Because when we commit dhunub, when we commit sins, we are indulging the lower selves. And indulging the lower selves is indulging the ego, is indulging our base desires, is cultivating those lower states of the self, the cattle-like, the predator-like, and the devil-like. But when we cultivate the angel-like, we are freer. Dhunub, the commission of dhunub, will jail us, will imprison us. The Quran uses terms like tatwiq, hawq, hijab, ran, and dhulma. All these words are synonymous with, of course, different emphases on the concept of jailing and of imprisonment. When we disobey Allah, when we sin, we are enslaving ourselves. We're not freeing ourselves. We are not truly seeking the happiness and the freedom of the righteous. We're not seeking the divine. We're seeking that which is less than the divine. And anything less than the divine, if we are too focused on it, if we are oriented on it, if our lives become focused on it, then we lose infinity. We lose divine beauty, divine majesty, divine freedom, divine happiness inside of us. I say these words to you, and I pray that when we meet next time, we shall delve more in the beautiful field of freedom and happiness of the righteous. I leave you in the care and merciful love and peace of Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.